Millions died under Stalinism, the overwhelming majority for political reasons in a horrific reign that sought to control every aspect of Soviet lives. While the victory over Nazi Germany cannot be forgotten to the cost of 20 million Russian lives, his dictatorship outside of this is littered with the worst of deeds. Welcome to Bizarre History. Today we examine the 7 worst acts committed by dictator Joseph Stalin. There's an argument that Stalin may have quite possibly been the worst dictator we've seen in recorded history. He faces some competition, however. In the 20th century alone, the Armenian genocide was committed by the Ottoman Empire at the start of the century. Mao Zedong's leadership killed millions upon millions of Chinese during the conditions of the Great Leap Forward. Of course, Stalin's most regular dictator in comparison is Adolf Hitler, the architect of the history-staining Holocaust of 6 million Jews. Stalinism's cost to the Soviet population was not lost in the eyes of many of his contemporaries. Soon after he died in 1953, it was almost instantly abandoned. The terror and costs caused by Stalin's totalitarian rule are virtually unimaginable. Here's a rundown of the 7 worst acts under the rule of Joseph Stalin. While the Soviet defeat of Nazi forces was welcomed worldwide and was a tremendous victory, the actions of Russian soldiers upon marching through German soil didn't go unnoticed. Russian soldiers were infamous for their inhumane treatment of German civilians, particularly women who were raped in considerable numbers. Stalin, by most accounts, was unmoved by these violent acts of his men. He used the same iron fist on his soldiers as he did on his citizens. If they did what he pleased on the battlefield, in other words, were victorious, Stalin was indifferent to any other details. Legend has it that when the rape culture of Soviet forces abroad was brought to Stalin, he's alleged to have responded, "What's so awful in his having fun with a woman after such horrors?" Another strand that can only belong to a dictator. Stalin, a rape culture apologist. Stalin's treatment of prisoners of war was no less shocking than his treatment of other wartime Soviets. In what was typically cold and unflinching in its stance, Stalin was to declare that Russia had no prisoners of war, only traitors to the motherland. Russians fighting for their homeland in World War II who found themselves captured by German forces quite possibly faced a fate worse than death. While the Allies treated returning prisoners of war as the bravest of the brave with the respect deserving of heroes, Stalin had other ideas for captured Russians. Returning Russian POWs would be given a harsh repatriation process. All returning were liable to be interrogated, millions were sent to the Gulag, and some thousands were shot. So brutal was Stalin's regime, it held one success from its crushing weight upon its citizens. The 5-year plan did throw Russia decades ahead of where it was at the start of the plan. By 1932, it was an industrialized country, and by most accounts, without these efforts, particularly the development of sizable factories and extensive railroads, it would never have been able to defend itself from the German invasion in World War II. Yet, total control of his people was Stalin's primary aim, and no more so than in wartime. When Stalingrad faced approaching German forces in 1942, Stalin issued the ice-cold order number 227. Should any soldier flinch, flee, desert, or cower in the face of the German invasion, the order stated that they were to be killed on the spot, no posture or pose. Stalin ordered guard units at the backlines of Soviet battalions to ensure any retreating would be stopped unequivocally. Exactly how many Soviet soldiers were killed by their fellow countrymen may never be known. Continuing his favorite tradition of using fear for social control, in 1936, Stalin initiated the Great Purge. The goal was to ensure total loyalty to the Communist Party within its ranks and across the nation. Some historians marked the purge within the party as Stalin's way of extinguishing the intelligentsia. The severity of the purge is clear in the numbers. Of the 103 most senior members of the Communist Party, Stalin had a staggering 81 murdered. By its end, the purge had taken over a third of the Communist Party's members. Stalin's use of the NKVD was infamous, and the fear its reputation held caused a domino effect. Arrests were by the hundreds of thousands, with people only being sent to their death in the Gulag. At its height, citizens would turn in and make accusations against their closest in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Chillingly, the Great Purge was so unrelenting it took on a self-cannibalizing. Even the head of the NKVD was executed. The Kolyazchev's death in 1940 stands as an incredible example of the purge's darkness. Among many others of the party and public figures, Stalin also had purge victims removed from their photographs. A dictator is always sure to legally cover their tracks. Stalin must have figured, you can't be accused of killing people who were never really there. The Holodomor is an infamous famine only made possible by the inhumane policies of Joseph Stalin. Occurring between 1932 to 1933, the Holodomor took approximately 14.5 million lives through starvation. The death toll has been contested between different sources. Some of this debate is down to the significant proportion of those killed were Ukrainian and Kazakh. The most brutal and significant of the Holodomor that separates it from other famines is the lack of preceding drought. All this starvation was entirely geared by Stalin's intentional policy to take food production away from small farms. Stalin quite purposely assured food shortages to a near tactical degree. He was encouraging and welcoming to the application of shortages in some regions more than others. The Lenin maxim of those who do not work, neither shall eat, was taken to a sickening extreme. An alarming man-made famine. The consensus of historians regard the Holodomor as genocide, with Stalin as the architect. The Great Famine is one of the points used when Stalinism is compared to Nazism. Only a dictator willing to kill by the millions and throw their own society into dysfunction would take such an action. 1928 to 1932 were the most important years of Stalin's reign. They were certainly the ones of most consequence. His 5-year plan was the vision to take Russia from an agricultural country to an industrial one to compete with its capitalist rival nations. Collectivization was the process of the state taking the property of peasant farmers and bringing it under state control. Stalin being Stalin, this in practical terms meant an all-out war on the peasant class. Dekulakization was the term used to dispossess, murder, exile, and send peasant farmers to the Gulag. These movements against overwhelmingly poorer citizens altered the lives of millions. One of the most selective motions Stalin took against his citizens in the name of social control was the use of special settlements. This remarkably required transferring entire populations to other parts of the country, usually with not much more than initial rations to start their settlement and the watch of the NKVD. Dekulakization was in the long run a self-created disaster for Stalin. It left an entire class virtually extinct and ended up damaging the country's agriculture. Worst of all, it created the Great Famine. The Gulag was one of the most infamous chapters of Soviet history. Its creation came from Vladimir Lenin in the 1920s. While the description of the Gulag is simplified as a collection of labor camps, that's forced labor, mind you, the purpose was entirely political. However, Lenin wanted any potential threat to the Bolshevik party behind bars. With the Gulag's network of camps, any party critical of communism, subversive, or even those who simply couldn't be controlled or defined by class were interned to the Gulag. Political prisoners were the majority of the inmates of the Gulag, but would have been housed alongside those with legitimate criminal convictions. Stalin's use of the Gulag came alongside collectivization and the Second World War, meaning peasant landowners not wanting to lose their keep to the state were to be interned, as were prisoners of war. The numbers of the Gulag system are as terrifying as the concept itself. Approaching 4 million Soviet citizens from 1931 to 1953 would have been sent to these forced labor camps, predominantly situated in the freezing reaches of Arctic Siberia. Though the majority would have been worked to total physical exhaustion, around 800,000 were shot. To truly understand the Gulag's purpose is not to view it as a killing machine to murder millions. That was never the case. Though as many as 14 million people were interned in the war years of 1943 to 44, only 1.5 million ever died. At heart, the Gulag was designed to control society through fear. Stalin gave the NKVD unprecedented powers to intern citizens. The threat of the Gulag cast a shadow over all. If you want to hear more about Stalin's dictatorship, let us know in the comments section below. Like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thanks for watching Bizarre History, and we'll see you next time.